Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Silent Room.
I pulled off the highway, the rain pounding against my windshield like 1,000 frantic fingers. The long stretch of road had become increasingly desolate, and I was desperate to find a place to rest. That's when I spotted the flickering neon sign of a motel, half obscured by the darkness. Vacancy, it buzzed weakly, and with a sigh of relief, I turned into the gravel driveway. As I parked, I noticed the motel looked older than I'd anticipated. The paint was peeling, and the flickering lights above the entrance only added to the eerie atmosphere. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the storm, water instantly soaking through my shoes. Each step toward the entrance felt like walking through a forgotten time, as if the motel had been untouched by the outside world for decades. The lobby was dimly lit, and an old fan creaked overhead, stirring the stale air. Behind the counter stood a gaunt man, his features obscured by the shadows. He wore a threadbare uniform, and his eyes were sunken, darting to the side as I approached. "Good evening," I said, trying to mask the unease curling in my stomach. "Welcome," he replied in a flat tone, his gaze fixed on something distant. "Checking in?" "Yeah, just need a room for the night. Long drive, you know." He handed me a key with a shaky hand, glancing toward the door. "Just don't go into room 12. I raised an eyebrow. "Is it occupied?" "No, it's just best if you stay away from it." His tone sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. "Okay, no problem. Just a room to sleep in, right?" He nodded slowly, still not making eye contact. "You can have room 12, but I recommend you take another one." "Is there a reason? Is it haunted or something?" I chuckled nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Not haunted. Just strange things happen there. The last guests never checked out." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My heart raced, but I couldn't show fear. "I'll be fine. I'll take room 12, I insisted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice barely a whisper as he handed me the key. I felt the weight of his warning pressing on my shoulders, but stubbornness pushed me forward. With a quick thanks, I turned away, clutching the key tightly. I made my way down the dim corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. Room 12 was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside, feeling a sense of normalcy wash over me. The room looked decent enough, a small bed, a rickety desk, and a window that overlooked the dark, rain-soaked forest. But as I closed the door behind me, the unease returned, creeping up my spine. Ignoring the warning, I threw my bag on the bed and took a deep breath. "It's just a room," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the dread settling in my gut. I decided to unpack, reminding myself that I needed rest. But as I lay down in the quiet, the soft patter of rain on the roof turned into something more, a strange, whispering sound emerging from the walls. I frowned, trying to dismiss it. The fatigue was getting to me, I thought. I was just hearing things. Little did I know, the night was only beginning, and the secrets of room 12 were waiting to unfold. The rain continued to drum against the window, a relentless rhythm that should have been soothing, but it only heightened my unease. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt too still, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I rolled over, turning on the TV, hoping some noise would drown out the whispers that were beginning to coil around me. But even with the television blaring, I could still hear it, a low, indistinct murmur, just at the edge of my consciousness. I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. After all, I was exhausted from driving for hours, and this motel had an unsettling vibe. Hours slipped by, and I could feel my eyelids growing heavy. As I drifted in and out of sleep, the whispers began to solidify into words, though I couldn't quite make them out. "Help us! Get out!" The phrases danced in my mind, teasing me with a sense of urgency. I shot upright in bed, heart racing, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. "Just the wind," I told myself, forcing a laugh to ease the tension. "I'm just tired." I took a deep breath and swung my legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the cool, worn carpet. Maybe some water would help clear my head. As I padded to the bathroom, I stopped short, the whispering growing louder, wrapping around me like a vice. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block it out, but the voices surged as if they were coming from inside my own mind. "Get out! Help us!" The words were clearer now, desperate and haunting. I stumbled back, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back. I turned on the bathroom light, the flickering bulb casting eerie shadows on the walls. I splashed water on my face, hoping to wash away the unease, but the whispers persisted, more insistent than before. I returned to the bed, pulling the sheets tightly around me, but the feeling of being watched enveloped me. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing and waiting. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to swing open, revealing whatever was lurking in the dark. I had to get out of this room. The thought pounded in my head, but the fear of what lay beyond the door kept me rooted in place. I tried to focus on the TV, but the words on the screen blurred together. The whispering grew louder, no longer just echoes of sound, but distinct voices, crying out for help. I gripped the blankets, my knuckles turning white as I fought the rising panic. I needed to confront this. I couldn't let fear win. I decided I would wait until the morning, and then I'd confront the receptionist. He had to know something. Maybe he could explain the sounds, maybe even offer another room. But for now, I just needed to survive the night. As I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whispers morphed into soft knocks, rhythmic and urgent. The visitor was back. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone to check the time, 2:47 a.m. I wasn't sure if the storm was amplifying my fears or if something truly sinister was at play. As the knocks grew louder, I felt the icy grip of dread settle in my stomach. I had to know who, or what, was behind that door. I forced myself to stand, each step toward the door feeling like wading through molasses. My heart pounded in my chest, and with every knock, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had to open it. I had to see what was waiting on the other side. I stood frozen in front of the door, the knocking resonating through the quiet room like a drumbeat. The whispers had subsided, but the air felt electric, thick with an unseen presence. My pulse quickened as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating just for a moment. What if it was just a prank? A figment of my imagination fueled by exhaustion and fear? But the persistent knocking wouldn't let me go back to sleep. I took a deep breath, steeling my resolve, and twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I peered out, squinting into the dim light. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the echo of my own words fading into silence. I felt a chill run down my spine as I glanced left and right, but the hallway was empty. Just as I was about to retreat back into my room, I noticed a shadow flicker at the end of the corridor. My heart raced. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Still, no reply came. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, lurking just out of sight. I felt compelled to step out further, curiosity outweighing my fear. I took a cautious step into the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder as I moved further from my room. I strained to listen, half expecting the whispers to return. Instead, I heard faint laughter, distant but clear, as if someone was having a conversation just beyond my reach. I was drawn toward it, unable to resist the pull. As I approached room 10, the laughter stopped abruptly. I froze, dread washing over me. Was someone else here? I knocked softly on the door, hoping to find another traveler who might help me make sense of this place. "Hello. Is anyone in there?" Silence answered me, and my heart sank. I turned to go back to my room when I heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help us! Help us!" I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The voice seemed to be coming from behind the door of room 12. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the compulsion to find out what lay within. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows and filling the air with a sense of urgency. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob of room 12. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting for me to unlock it. The door swung open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness, save for the flickering light from my own room spilling in. I peered inside, heart racing, but saw nothing unusual, just an unmade bed, a dusty dresser, and walls covered in faded wallpaper. I stepped in, feeling an odd pull to explore further. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. As I moved deeper into the room, I could hear the whispers more clearly now. "Help us! Help us!" They were desperate, pleading. I turned my head, searching for the source, but the room was empty. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the temperature dropped even further, my breath visible in the air. Suddenly, I noticed something in the corner, a figure barely discernible in the shadows. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I took a step closer, the figure materialized. It was a woman, her features gaunt and pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have to help us. We can't escape." I stumbled back, a wave of horror crashing over me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The woman stepped forward, her eyes pleading, but the darkness of the room enveloped her. "Get out!" she cried, her voice a mixture of desperation and terror. "You don't belong here." Panic surged through me, and I banged on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "Let me out, please." But the door wouldn't budge. The whispers intensified, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. As I backed away, I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, clammy hand gripping my wrist. I turned in horror to face the figure, but the moment I made eye contact, everything went dark. The world around me faded, and all I could hear was the woman's voice echoing in the void. "Help us! Please help us!" I awoke gasping, the air thick and suffocating, like I had been submerged underwater. My heart raced as I struggled to sit up, the weight of an unseen force pressing down on me. I was back in room 12, the same faded wallpaper looming around me, the flickering light casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I blinked, trying to shake off the disorientation, but the whispers surrounded me once more. "Help us! Help us!" The voices echoed in my mind, wrapping around me like a shroud. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. This was no dream. The nightmare was all too real. Panic surged again as I realized the door was still shut tight. I rushed to it, pounding my fists against the wood. "Let me out! Please, someone help me!" My voice cracked, desperation seeping into every word. But all I heard in response was the chilling laughter of the unseen entities, ringing in my ears like a twisted lullaby. Turning back to the room, I scanned the walls for any sign of an escape. That's when I noticed something unusual. Markings etched into the wallpaper, barely visible in the dim light. I approached the wall, running my fingers over the grooves. They felt almost like words. "Trapped, forever. Cannot leave," I whispered, my heart sinking as I deciphered the ominous message. My mind raced with the implications. Had others been trapped here too? Had they scratched their pleas into the walls, hoping for someone to hear them? The whispers grew louder, the urgency rising, almost pleading. "Help us! Help us!" The chilling chorus echoed in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. I was surrounded by something sinister, something that thrived on fear. In a fit of determination, I started searching for a way out. I pulled the dresser away from the wall, revealing a small, dusty window hidden behind it. I rushed over, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Maybe I could escape through there. The window was stuck, layers of grime and age sealing it shut. I pushed and pulled, grunting with effort, until finally it budged. With one final shove, it swung open, the cold night air rushing in like a breath of fresh life. But as I climbed onto the ledge, a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the room, freezing me in place. I turned to look back, and there, standing in the shadows, was the woman. Her face was gaunt, eyes wide with an unsettling mix of sorrow and anger. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice twisted and broken. "You don't understand. If you go out there, you'll never come back." I hesitated, the choice weighing heavily on me. Should I trust her? Or was this all part of the trap? The whispers crescendoed, drowning out my thoughts as they spiraled into a frenzy of panic. "Help us! Help us!" The fear of the unknown clawed at my chest, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to escape. I could feel the darkness closing in, and it fed off my fear. With a final push of determination, I jumped out of the window, landing hard on the ground outside. I looked back at the room, breathless, but the window was already closing, the darkness enveloping it once more. I stumbled back, panting, my heart racing. But the moment I turned to run down the empty road, I heard it again, the knocking. It echoed from the window, loud and insistent, followed by the whispers growing even louder. "Help us! Please help us!" My pulse quickened as I sprinted away from the motel, the oppressive atmosphere hanging heavily in the air behind me. I had to get away, away from the darkness, away from the voices. But as I ran, the realization hit me. I had escaped the room, but I hadn't escaped its hold. I could still feel the chilling presence trailing behind me, the weight of the whispers lingering in my ears, a constant reminder of the horror that lay within those walls. I ran down the deserted road, my feet pounding against the gravel as the night air whipped around me. Each breath felt labored, filled with a mix of adrenaline and fear. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could still hear the whispers, curling around me like smoke, taunting me with their eerie pleas for help. As I reached the edge of the motel property, I turned onto the main road, my eyes scanning for any sign of life. I was desperate to escape the horror I had just endured. But my heart sank when I noticed that the road was empty, nothing but darkness stretching ahead. I stumbled along, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just witnessed. Who were those people? Why were they trapped in that room? And what was that woman trying to warn me about? Questions swirled in my head, but there was one thing I knew for sure. I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. Just as I thought I could catch my breath, I heard a familiar sound, soft knocking. My heart dropped. It echoed through the night, relentless and chilling, just like it had from inside room 12. I instinctively glanced back at the motel, but all I could see was the faint outline of the building, looming in the shadows like a hungry predator. I quickened my pace, hoping to put distance between myself and that sinister place, but the knocking persisted, each rap vibrating in my chest. "Help us! Help us!" The voices returned, desperate and haunting. "Stop it!" I shouted into the darkness, my voice breaking. "Leave me alone!" But they only grew louder, a cacophony of sorrow and despair echoing through the night. I didn't want to think about what it meant, but deep down, I felt a pull, a connection to those trapped souls. Their anguish wrapped around me, tugging at my conscience, almost as if they were calling out to me for help. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned my head, panic flooding my senses, but there was nothing there. Just the desolate road and the shadows that danced in the dim light of the moon. I began to sprint, each step heavy with dread. The whispers transformed into urgent cries, imploring me to return, to help them escape the darkness that held them captive. I could feel their presence, hovering at the edges of my awareness, threatening to pull me back into that room. "Please!" I yelled, tears streaming down my face as I continued to run. "I can't help you. I can't go back." But just as I reached a clearing, the world around me began to shift. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the trees warped into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like claws. It felt as if the very landscape was transforming, echoing the torment of the souls trapped in the motel. Before I could comprehend what was happening, I found myself standing at the motel entrance again, as if I had never left. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow across the empty parking lot. The air grew thick with despair, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Help us! Help us!" My heart raced as I looked around, feeling the weight of their longing pressing down on me. I was trapped in a loop, caught between the world I had fled and the horror of that room. The motel loomed before me, an eternal reminder of the darkness I couldn't escape. "No!" I screamed, stepping back. "I won't go in there. I refuse." But as I turned to flee, the door to room 12 creaked open, a dark silhouette standing in the threshold. The woman's face appeared, gaunt and hollow, eyes wide and pleading. "You can't escape your fate," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo in the night. "You are one of us now." In that moment, I felt an icy grip around my heart. The realization washed over me like cold water. I was part of this nightmare, tethered to the souls within those walls, forever drawn back to the darkness I had tried to flee. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, the whispers morphed into a deafening roar, and I felt myself being pulled toward the room, unable to resist. I could see the shadows inside, twisting and writhing, inviting me back into the abyss. And just like that, the world around me faded to black, leaving only the whispers that echoed in the void. "Help us! Help us!" In that silence, I realized the truth. I would never truly escape.
The Midnight Visitor.
I was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and clings to your eyelids like lead. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a blanket of darkness that enveloped the desolate highway. I had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt lulling me into a trance. When I spotted the flickering neon sign for a roadside motel, a flicker of hope ignited within me. Vacancy, my body begged for rest, and the thought of pushing on through the night felt like torture. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, my headlights illuminating the run-down facade of the place. The paint was peeling, and the windows were grimy, but at that moment, I was too exhausted to care. As I stepped inside the lobby, I was met with a dimly lit room sparsely furnished with a few mismatched chairs. A lone bulb flickered above the counter, casting long shadows across the floor. Behind the desk sat a thin man, hunched over a ledger, his glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Check in," I croaked, my voice hoarse from hours of driving. "Sure," he replied, barely above a whisper. He slid a key across the counter without meeting my gaze, as if he were reluctant to acknowledge my presence. I grabbed the key, a heavy brass number 7, and headed down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. Each step felt heavier than the last, and an unsettling feeling settled in my gut, urging me to turn back. But the call of sleep was too strong. I entered my room and locked the door behind me, the click of the lock echoing in the silence. The room was as dingy as I'd expected, with faded wallpaper and a musty smell that clung to the air. But it was a place to lay my head, at least for a few hours. I tossed my bag onto the bed and flicked on the lamp. Its light flickering like it, too, was weary from its duty. After a quick shower to wash away the grime of the road, I collapsed onto the bed, ready to surrender to sleep. The rain outside began to patter against the window, a soothing backdrop to my exhaustion. Just as I was about to slip into a deep slumber, I heard it, a loud, insistent knocking at my door. I froze, my heart racing. It was the dead of night. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour? I lay there, my mind racing with possibilities, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind playing tricks. But the knocking continued, loud and relentless, echoing through the stillness of the motel. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. I hesitated for a moment, then decided I had to see. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and crept toward the door, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity propelled me forward. I grasped the doorknob, my heart thumping in my chest, and took a deep breath before pulling it open. The hallway lay empty before me. No one, just the dim light casting eerie shadows against the walls. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. "Hello," I called out, but only the sound of my voice bounced back at me. Just as I was about to close the door, the knocking started again, this time more insistent, echoing from the other side as if demanding my attention. I looked down the empty corridor, dread coiling in my stomach, but I wasn't ready to face whatever was out there. I stepped back into my room, closed the door, and locked it tightly. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I could ignore it and go back to sleep. But the knocking grew louder, a rhythmic beat that felt like a countdown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was outside wasn't going away. I lay back down, pulling the covers tightly around me, but sleep eluded me. I could still hear it. Knock, knock, knock. growing more frantic with every passing second. Just when I thought the knocking would stop, it only intensified, each thud reverberating through the room like a drumbeat in the silence. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall back asleep, but the sound sliced through the darkness, pulling me further from the comfort of dreams. Maybe it's just someone playing a prank, I muttered to myself, my voice barely above a whisper. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dead of night. But deep down, a nagging dread festered in my gut, reminding me that this was no ordinary motel. The incessant knocking was now accompanied by an unsettling whisper, barely audible but distinct enough to make my skin crawl. It sounded like my name, soft and persistent, mingling with the rain tapping against the window. I tried to focus on the sound of the storm, but the whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a fog, suffocating and cold. Heart pounding, I pulled the blankets over my head, hoping to block out the noise, but the whispers found their way through. "Jake, Jake," it called, a voice I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. I fought the urge to shout back, to demand to know who was out there, but fear kept my voice lodged in my throat. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. A chilling silence enveloped the room, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. I dared to peek out from under the covers, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. My heart still raced, but the stillness felt more oppressive than the noise had been. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again, this time coming from inside my room. A soft creak echoed from the bathroom, and my stomach dropped. I shot upright in bed, every nerve ending on high alert. My eyes darted around the dimly lit room, searching for the source of the sound. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice quivering. I hesitated, wondering if I should reach for my phone, but the thought of moving sent waves of dread crashing over me. The creaking continued, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to taunt me. I was frozen, caught in a web of fear. I knew I should get up, check the bathroom, make sure I was alone, but my body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to hide under the covers and pretend this was all just a nightmare. But the whispering returned, now a frantic chorus. "Jake, let me in." It wasn't just a voice. It was an overwhelming presence, filling the room with a suffocating weight. The air felt charged, as if something malevolent was about to happen. Finally, adrenaline surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my heart racing as I stood. The cool floor beneath my feet felt grounding, but every shadow in the room seemed to shift, reminding me I was not alone. I took a tentative step toward the bathroom, my breath shallow and quick. The creaking noise stopped, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a split second before turning it. The door swung open, revealing darkness within. I flipped on the light switch, and the harsh fluorescent bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly glow across the small space. I peered inside, half expecting to see someone lurking in the corner. But there was nothing, just the empty bathroom, a cracked mirror reflecting my wide-eyed terror back at me. I turned back to the main room, the feeling of being watched washing over me once more. I backed away slowly, a cold sweat prickling my skin. The door was locked, and I was alone, or so I thought. But as I turned to retreat back to the safety of my bed, I heard it again. This time, the knocking came from inside the room, a soft, urgent sound, just behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moved, barely visible in the corner of my eye, and I froze, caught in a nightmare that was only just beginning. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat as the shadow flickered just at the edge of my vision. Panic clawed at my insides, urging me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The knocking persisted, now sounding like it was right next to me, echoing in the silence of the room. I could hardly process what was happening. It felt like my mind was fracturing under the weight of fear. I slowly turned my head, forcing myself to confront whatever was lurking behind me. The room was dimly lit, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, and I strained to see clearly. My heart pounded like a war drum, drowning out all other sounds. The presence was there, just out of reach, flickering in and out of the light like a candle struggling against the wind. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling as I tried to sound braver than I felt. But the only response was silence, thick and suffocating. Then I caught a glimpse of something, a figure, barely human, standing just beyond the edge of the light. My stomach twisted as I squinted, desperate to discern what I was seeing. The figure was shrouded in shadows, its features obscured. I could only make out a vague outline, but something in the way it loomed made the hair on my arms stand on end. In a moment of sheer instinct, I dashed to the door, fumbling with the lock. The only thought in my mind was to escape this nightmare, to get as far away from whatever that was. As I turned the key, the knocking came again, louder and more insistent, rattling my resolve. "Let me in," a voice whispered, barely more than a breath, yet it sliced through the air with chilling clarity. It sounded eerily familiar, but I couldn't place it. My heart raced as I glanced back, and to my horror, I saw the figure take a step forward, its face still shrouded in darkness. With a burst of adrenaline, I threw the door open and bolted into the hallway. The cool air hit me like a slap, and for a brief moment, I felt relief. But it was short-lived. I turned to run toward the exit, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the walls seeming to close in around me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the corridor, desperately searching for a way out. I could still hear the whispers trailing behind me, urging me to stop. "Jake, come back," they beckoned, and I felt a chill grip my spine. The figure was following, just out of sight, but I could feel it, a cold presence creeping closer with each step I took. Finally, I spotted the exit sign glowing dimly at the far end of the hallway. I pushed my legs harder, racing toward it, my mind a whirl of fear and confusion. I was almost there when I tripped over something, an old rug that had curled up at the edges, and crashed to the ground. "Get up, get up!" I shouted at myself, scrambling to my feet, but the moment I did, I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, grasped my shoulder. I froze, a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The whispers surrounded me now, a chorus of voices that seemed to seep into my very being. "Jake, why are you running?" The voice was softer now, almost soothing, but it sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the figure pressing closer, the weight of its presence nearly suffocating me. I finally turned to face it, my heart pounding in my chest like a frantic bird trying to escape a cage. The figure stepped into the light, and I gasped. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. He wore a faded uniform, the kind I'd seen in old photographs, and I realized with horror that this was the same man from the reception desk. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a slow, unnerving grin that revealed teeth too white against his sickly complexion. "You checked in, Jake. Now you must stay," he said, his voice dripping with a disconcerting calmness. My mind raced. I needed to escape this place, but the figure was blocking my only way out. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the walls closing in on me, the shadows curling around my ankles, anchoring me to the spot. "No, I can't stay," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "I need to leave." But as I tried to back away, I stumbled, and the darkness enveloped me. I could feel the weight of the figure pressing in, the whispers swirling around me like a storm. I was trapped, ensnared in a nightmare that refused to let go. I was in a place where time stood still, where reality blurred with the horrific echoes of the past. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just facing a ghost. I was staring into the very heart of fear itself. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, my mind racing to make sense of the impossibility of my situation. The figure before me was all too real, yet it was clear that I was not in the realm of the living. I could feel the shadows closing in, their presence like a suffocating fog, wrapping around me, weighing me down. "Stay with me, Jake," the ghostly figure said, his voice a haunting whisper that echoed in the confined space. "You don't understand yet. This place, it's where souls like mine linger, waiting for someone to listen, to remember." I shook my head, refusing to accept the absurdity of his words. "I don't want to listen. I want to leave." My heart pounded like a war drum in my chest, desperate to escape the terrifying grip of this otherworldly presence. He stepped closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. "You think you can just walk away? You've checked in. This is your new reality. We are all trapped here, Jake. Trapped by our own choices, by the regrets we carry." The shadows seemed to writhe around him, as if they were alive, echoing his despair. I could feel their chilling fingers creeping toward me, urging me to join them in this eternal limbo. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like lead, anchored to the ground by the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. "Why are you telling me this?" The ghost sighed, a sound filled with sorrow that reverberated through the stillness of the motel corridor. "Because you're like me. You're weary, running from something. You seek rest, but the price of that rest is your soul. I thought I could find solace here, but instead, I became part of the walls, part of the echoes that haunt this place. The others, they too sought refuge, only to find themselves forever bound." "Others," I echoed, dread pooling in my stomach. "What others?" The shadows seemed to pulse as he spoke, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "The previous guests who never left. The ones who thought this motel would be a sanctuary, only to discover too late that it was their tomb. They roamed these halls, desperate for someone to help them break the cycle." As he spoke, images flashed in my mind. Flashes of faces from the photographs I'd seen in the lobby, smiling faces that now seemed twisted in anguish. Each guest, each lost soul, a reminder of the price I might pay for this fleeting night of rest. "Get away from me!" I shouted, my voice filled with a mixture of anger and terror. I turned to run again, but as I did, the shadows lunged, wrapping around my legs like a tightening noose. The cold seeped into my bones, paralyzing me with fear. "Jake, you can't escape," the figure called, his voice echoing eerily. "You can't run from what's inside you." With a sudden surge of strength, I broke free from the shadow's grip and dashed down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from him, from the truth that threatened to swallow me whole. The motel felt like a maze, every turn leading me deeper into its sinister heart. I spotted a fire exit sign in the distance and sprinted toward it, praying that it would lead me to freedom. The whispers followed me, now a cacophony of voices, pleading, begging for release. "Help us! Help us!" they cried, their desperation clawing at my mind. "Don't leave us behind!" I pushed through the heavy door, bursting into a stairwell dimly lit by emergency lights. The cold concrete felt grounding beneath my feet, but I could still hear the shadows swirling behind me, taunting me with their chilling song. I raced down the stairs, not daring to look back. I reached the ground floor and pushed through another door, bursting into the parking lot. The rain had intensified, drenching me as I stumbled into the open air. For a moment, I thought I was free. The oppressive weight lifted, and I gasped for breath, my heart racing as I scanned the empty lot. But then, I felt it again, a presence lurking just beyond my sight. The shadows were still with me, lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering their dark secrets. I rushed to my car, fumbling with the keys in my trembling hands. The storm raged around me, lightning illuminating the darkened motel behind me. As I climbed into the car and slammed the door shut, I glanced back at the building. That's when I saw him again. The ghost stood at the entrance, his eyes hollow and filled with despair, and for a brief moment I felt a twinge of sympathy for the lost souls trapped within those walls. But I couldn't linger. I had to escape. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, the motel fading into the distance. But as I drove into the stormy night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still with me, whispering their haunting refrain, a reminder that some places never let you go, no matter how far you run. As I sped away from the motel, the rain lashed against my windshield like 1,000 frantic hands trying to pull me back. My heart raced, not just from fear, but from the cold realization that the encounter might not be over. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly figure chasing after me, but there was nothing but the dark road behind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. "Just keep driving," I told myself, the words barely breaking through the noise in my mind. Yet, as I drove deeper into the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The roads were slick and treacherous, the headlights illuminating only a few feet ahead of me. Each shadow on the side of the road seemed to flicker and dance, and I had to remind myself that they were nothing more than trees, branches swaying in the wind. But I couldn't ignore the creeping dread that clawed at my chest, whispering that the shadows were still watching. I turned on the radio, desperately seeking something to drown out the silence, but all I found was static. No songs, no voices, just the disquieting hum of the empty airwaves. I fiddled with the knobs, hoping for a distraction, but nothing changed. It was as if the world around me was swallowing sound whole, leaving me trapped in a suffocating silence. Come on," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. A voice came through, deep and distorted, like a nightmare made manifest. "You can't escape, Jake. You belong to us now." I slammed my hand on the off button, but the voice continued, echoing in my mind. "You can't run from your past. You are one of us. You checked in, and now you're trapped. Stop it. Just stop." I shouted, my voice breaking. I couldn't tell if the voice was coming from the radio or if it was in my head, but it felt all too real. I could almost hear the whispers of those lost souls from the motel, their pleas mingling with the static, growing louder and more insistent. The road began to twist and turn in front of me, a never-ending path that seemed to stretch into oblivion. Panic surged again as I realized I wasn't moving forward. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, but the car felt sluggish, as if the engine was weighed down by the very shadows I'd escaped. Desperation clawed at my throat, and I fought to regain control. "Get a grip, Jake. Just focus," I shouted, shaking my head to clear the fog that clouded my thoughts. I forced myself to look at the road ahead, trying to steady my breathing, but the darkness felt suffocating, and I could still sense them creeping closer. Then, I caught sight of something in the distance, a faint flicker of light cutting through the storm. My heart lifted momentarily. Maybe it was a gas station, a beacon of safety in this nightmare. I pressed on, urging the car faster, praying I wasn't imagining it. As I approached, the light grew brighter, revealing a small roadside diner. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow against the stormy backdrop. Relief flooded through me. I could finally find help, a moment of solace away from the shadows. I pulled into the lot, tires screeching as I parked haphazardly. I dashed to the entrance, rain soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around other people, to hear their voices and break the terrifying silence that clung to me like a shroud. As I burst through the door, a bell tinkled, and I was greeted by a warm wave of light and the smell of coffee. The diner was nearly empty, but the few patrons looked up at me with curious expressions. My heart raced with relief, but it quickly dissipated as I noticed something unsettling. The waitress behind the counter had a name tag that read Martha. I blinked, and my blood ran cold. I recognized her from the photographs in the motel lobby, one of the smiling faces of the past. My stomach twisted in knots as dread settled back into my bones. "Martha, can I help you?" she asked, her voice too sweet, too inviting, as if she were genuinely glad to see me. Yeah, just coffee, please." I tried to sound calm, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I took a seat at the counter, my mind racing, and watched her as she poured the steaming liquid. I glanced at the other patrons. They were eerily still, their faces blank as they stared into their plates. "What is happening here?" I whispered to myself, but the shadows seemed to dance just beyond my vision, lurking in the corners of the diner. As Martha slid a cup in front of me, I noticed the flicker of the neon light through the window. It illuminated her face, and for a brief moment, I saw it, a flash of anguish, the same despair I had witnessed in the motel. My heart sank. She wasn't free either. She was a part of this twisted cycle. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled again, and I turned to see the entrance swing open. My breath caught in my throat as the rain-soaked figure stepped inside, drenched and dark like the storm itself. "Jake," he said, his voice smooth and haunting, "did you really think you could escape?" I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The diner faded around me, the walls closing in as realization set in. I was still trapped, still part of their haunting game. The shadows weren't just in the motel, they were everywhere, waiting for me to surrender, waiting for me to give in. As the figure approached, the diners turned their heads in unison, their eyes filled with a knowing emptiness. The reality of my situation crashed down on me, a wave of despair that threatened to consume me whole. There was no escaping the shadows. I was bound to them, checked in for an eternity of terror. As I sat there, coffee growing cold in front of me, I realized that the visitor of midnight was not just a visitor at all. He was a harbinger of my fate, and I was forever destined to roam the darkened halls of this haunting, restless nightmare.
Ghost check-in.
The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield like it was trying to break through. My wife, Sarah, was gripping the edge of her seat, her face pale as lightning flashed across the darkened sky. We'd been driving for hours, lost somewhere off the main highway, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing ahead. Through the downpour, a flickering neon sign emerged from the gloom, barely visible but unmistakable. Evergreen Lodge. It looked old and worn, like it hadn't been maintained in years. But it was shelter, and right now, we'd take anything to get out of this storm. We pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching over gravel. The place looked deserted. No other cars, no lights except for the faint glow coming from the reception area. The building itself was small, a single-story stretch of rooms, their windows dark and lifeless. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah's voice wavered as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "It's either this or spend the night in the car," I replied, though I wasn't so sure myself. There was something off about the place, but the storm was getting worse, and we didn't have much of a choice. We dashed through the rain, drenched by the time we reached the small awning that hung over the entrance. I opened the door to the reception area, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale air, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. The place was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering intermittently. A single desk sat in the center, and behind it, a man. He didn't look up when we entered. He just sat there, motionless, his hands resting on the counter in front of him. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with deep lines carved into his face. His uniform was strange, an outdated green jacket with the motel's name embroidered in gold on the chest. Hi," I said, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. "We'd like a room for the night." The man moved slowly, like every movement required effort. He didn't speak, just reached beneath the counter and pulled out a key, sliding it toward me without a word. His eyes never met mine. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional crack of thunder outside. I took the key, glancing at Sarah. Her unease mirrored mine, but neither of us said anything. We were both soaked and exhausted, and right now, all I wanted was to get to the room and collapse. The man finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Room 12. I nodded, thanked him, though it felt strange to do so, and we made our way back outside. The rain hadn't let up, and as we hurried down the row of doors, the oddness of the encounter settled over me like a heavy blanket. We found room 12 near the end of the building. The key slid easily into the lock, and as the door creaked open, the musty smell of the room hit us. It wasn't much, just a bed, a small table, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. But it was dry, and that was enough for now. I closed the door behind us, and for a moment, the howling wind and rain were replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Sarah shivered as she tossed her wet jacket onto a chair. "Something about this place," she started, but her voice trailed off. I knew exactly what she meant. There was something off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the emptiness of the place, or the strange, silent receptionist, or the way the storm seemed to press against the walls, making the room feel smaller than it was. We were both too tired to dwell on it for long. After drying off as best we could, we climbed into the bed, the sheets cold against our skin. I reached over to turn off the lamp, but paused. For just a second, I thought I heard something. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the floor. But when I strained my ears, it was gone, replaced by the steady patter of rain against the window. Shaking it off, I flicked the light off and lay back, trying to convince myself that the weirdness of the night was just the storm messing with my head. but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that room. I don't know how long I slept. It couldn't have been more than a few hours. I woke up suddenly, heart racing, but I wasn't sure why. The room was pitch black, and the only sound I could hear was the steady rhythm of rain against the window. Sarah was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even. For a moment, I tried to shake the feeling of unease, convincing myself that it was just the stress of the drive and the storm. But something gnawed at me. I felt unsettled, like I was being watched. I lay there, trying to calm my mind, but that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Faint, but distinct, moving slowly down the hallway outside our room. At first, I thought it might be another guest. But then I remembered the parking lot. It had been empty when we arrived. No other cars, no sign of life except for us and that strange man at the front desk. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Seconds passed, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, quietly, the doorknob twisted. It didn't open, but I could hear the soft creak of metal turning. Whoever was out there, they were trying to get in. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My body went rigid, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just lay there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open at any moment. But it never did. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, moving away from the door, down the hall, until they faded into nothing. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I reached for Sarah, gently shaking her awake. "Hey, wake up," I whispered. She stirred, blinking at me groggily. "What is it?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I heard something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone was outside the door. Her eyes widened, and she sat up quickly, looking around the room. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just the storm, or—" "No," I cut her off. "I'm sure. Someone was there. They tried to open the door." We both sat there in silence for a few moments, listening to the storm outside, straining to hear any other sounds. But everything was quiet now. Too quiet. "I'm going to check the hallway," I said, sliding out of bed as quietly as I could. "No, don't," Sarah started, but I was already moving toward the door. I needed to see for myself, to confirm that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any movement. Nothing. Slowly, I turned the knob and pulled the door open, just enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty. It stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb at the far end. The carpet was old and threadbare, and the air was cold, carrying with it that same stale, musty smell I'd noticed earlier. But there was no one there. No sign of movement, no sound of footsteps. Just emptiness. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet sinking into the damp carpet, and looked around. The other rooms were all closed, their doors as lifeless as they'd been when we first arrived. I took a few cautious steps down the hall, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And then I saw it. About halfway down the hall, near the wall, the carpet was wet. Not just damp from the storm, but soaked, as if someone had been standing there, dripping with water. A trail of wet footprints led from that spot, disappearing around the corner at the end of the hallway. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the wet spot. The footsteps I'd heard. They were real. Someone, something, had been outside our room. I backed up slowly, my hands shaking as I reached for the door to our room. I didn't care what was around that corner. I wasn't about to find out. When I got back inside, I locked the door behind me and turned to Sarah, my pulse racing. "There's something out there," I said, my voice barely steady. "Footprints. Wet footprints." She stared at me, her face pale. "What are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer. I felt trapped, with no way out, no way to explain what was happening. I just knew that we weren't alone in that motel. And whatever was out there, it was watching us. Neither of us slept after that. We lay in the darkness, listening for any sound, any hint that the footsteps would return. But the rest of the night passed in silence, save for the steady drum of rain outside. When the faint light of dawn crept through the curtains, I could feel the tension in the room start to ease, but only slightly. The storm had quieted to a drizzle, but the air inside still felt thick, like it was pressing in on us. "We should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We quickly gathered our things, stuffing them into our bags in silence. The thought of facing that empty hallway again made my skin crawl, but staying here felt worse. I glanced at the door, half expecting to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps again. But the only sound was the faint rustling of Sarah zipping up her bag. "We need to check out," I said, though part of me dreaded seeing that strange receptionist again. I opened the door cautiously, peeking into the hallway. It was as empty as it had been hours ago, but the wet footprints were gone. The carpet looked dry now, as if nothing had ever happened. We made our way down the hall, each step echoing through the quiet building. The tension between us was palpable, and every creak of the floor beneath our feet sent my heart racing. When we reached the reception area, it looked just as we'd left it, dimly lit, with the same stale smell hanging in the air. And there he was, the receptionist, sitting in the same place, wearing that same green jacket, his hands folded neatly on the desk. He didn't look up when we approached, didn't acknowledge us at all. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. I cleared my throat. "We're checking out." He didn't move. No response, no flicker of recognition. His face remained as blank and lifeless as the night before. Unease twisted in my gut. I glanced at Sarah, and she shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. Something was very wrong. "We're leaving," I said again, louder this time. Still nothing. The air in the room felt colder now, and I could feel a chill running down my spine. I reached for the bell on the desk and rang it once, the sharp sound cutting through the heavy silence. That's when I noticed the wall behind him. It was lined with old, faded photographs. Black and white pictures of the motel, its staff, and its guests. I hadn't paid much attention to them the night before, but now they caught my eye. Something about them seemed off. Curiosity tugged at me, despite my fear. I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes as I examined the photos. And then I saw him. In one of the pictures, near the center of the wall, was the receptionist. His face was younger, but unmistakable. He wore the same uniform, the same outdated green jacket, and stood with a group of employees in front of the motel. But the date at the bottom of the photograph sent a shiver through me. August 1973. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly scanned the other photos, my breath catching as I found him again and again. In each one, he looked the same, always standing at the front of the group, his expression never changing. But the dates kept shifting. 1959, 1965, 1980, decades apart, and yet he hadn't aged a day. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely audible.
Look.
She stepped closer, her eyes widening as she realized what I was seeing. "This can't be real," she said, her voice trembling. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The pieces clicked together in my mind, each one more impossible than the last. The motel's abandoned look, the empty parking lot, the strange feeling that had lingered since we arrived. And now, these photographs, proof that something was horribly wrong. I turned back to the receptionist, my pulse racing. His eyes were still fixed on some point ahead, as if we weren't even there. My throat tightened as a terrifying thought crossed my mind. "Sarah," I whispered, stepping back slowly. "He's dead." Her eyes shot to me, her face pale. What are you talking about?" "He's been dead for years." I pointed to the photos, my hand trembling. "Look at the dates. He hasn't aged. This place, it's not normal." Sarah's breath quickened, panic setting in. She grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "We need to go." "Now." I nodded, but my legs felt frozen, my body locked in place. It felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating us. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I forced myself to move, pulling Sarah toward the door. But just as we reached the exit, the receptionist finally spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." His voice was low and hollow, like it was coming from deep within the walls, reverberating through the empty room. We stopped dead in our tracks, fear tightening around us like a vice. Slowly, I turned to face him, my blood running cold. His eyes, which had been lifeless all this time, were now locked onto mine. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind them. Something dark, something ancient. "We never check out." His words hung in the air like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. "We never check out." I felt the blood drain from my face as the meaning of his statement sank in. Sarah gripped my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin, a silent plea for us to escape. But I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, caught in the suffocating grip of fear. "What do you mean?" I managed to stammer, forcing my voice to break through the thick tension. "What do you want from us?" The receptionist's expression didn't change. He remained as emotionless as the photographs on the wall. "This motel, it has its own rules. You can't leave. Not until you understand." I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow as I took a cautious step backward. The dim light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls, and I felt a growing sense of dread. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. "Sarah, we need to get out of here." "No," I said, finally breaking free of my paralysis. We turned to sprint for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was glued shut. Panic rose in my chest, and I yanked harder, but it wouldn't open. I turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with terror. "It won't open," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "Look," she gasped, pointing behind me. I turned just in time to see the receptionist standing up, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to grow taller, the shadows stretching around him as if they were alive, enveloping him in darkness. "You have to understand," he repeated, his voice a low, haunting whisper. "This place feeds off fear." I was shaking, unable to comprehend what he meant. My heart raced as I glanced back at the photographs, their faded edges seeming to pulse with an eerie life of their own. Each image showed the receptionist surrounded by people, all of them smiling, all of them looking blissfully unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath. I turned to Sarah, who was now shivering beside me, her eyes glistening with tears of fear. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice breaking. "We need to find another way out." In that moment, the lights flickered violently, plunging us into darkness for a heartbeat before they flickered back on. The receptionist had moved closer, his eyes now gleaming with an otherworldly light. His mouth twisted into a grin that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Let me show you," he said, his voice echoing like a distant thunder. "What happens to those who do not leave?" The photographs began to ripple, the images swirling like smoke until they solidified into something else. I gasped, stepping back as I saw faces appear, twisted in fear and anguish. They were trapped in the images, forever frozen in a moment of despair. "Stop it!" I shouted, horrified. But the receptionist simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the flickering lights, watching us with those piercing eyes. "Every soul that enters this motel becomes part of its history," he said, his voice now chillingly calm. "Once you check in, you can never check out. You'll become just another photograph on the wall, another lost traveler." I could feel the walls closing in on us, the shadows growing thicker. Desperation clawed at me. "What do we have to do?" I shouted. "Tell us how to leave." He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You must confront your fears. Only then will you be free." Before I could process what he meant, the lights flickered again, and a loud crash echoed from the back of the motel. The sound reverberated through the hall, a terrible, bone-chilling noise that sent a wave of panic through me. Sarah grabbed my hand, her grip like iron. "Let's go," I yelled, pulling her toward the back where the sound had come from, desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. We dashed down the hallway, the receptionist's voice fading behind us. "You can't escape your past. You can't run from the truth." As we reached the end of the hall, I stumbled to a stop. There was a door marked "Staff Only," the metal handle cold and rusty. I hesitated, fear gnawing at my insides, but I knew we had to try something. "Do you think we should go in there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It's our only chance," I replied, forcing my shaking hand to turn the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was musty, thick with the smell of mildew. My heart raced as I glanced back at the empty hallway, expecting to see the receptionist emerging from the shadows. "Let's go," I urged, stepping into the darkness, pulling Sarah with me. As we descended the stairs, the sound of the storm faded, replaced by a low, ominous hum that resonated through the walls. The atmosphere felt heavy, like we were stepping deeper into the bowels of the motel, a place where light and hope seemed to have been extinguished long ago. But I couldn't let fear take over. We had to find a way out. We had to confront whatever horrors awaited us in the depths of this haunted place. The air grew heavier as we descended into the abyss of the motel, our footsteps echoing against the damp concrete. Each step felt like a descent into a nightmare, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The low hum that reverberated through the walls sent chills down my spine, and I felt a presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It feels like something is watching us." "I know," I replied, trying to steady my breathing. "But we have to keep moving. We can't let it catch us." The staircase twisted down into darkness, and I squinted to see. At the bottom, a dim light flickered, illuminating what appeared to be a small room filled with dusty furniture and old, rotting boxes. I hesitated at the threshold, sensing an overwhelming energy in the air, something ancient and restless. "Are you ready?" I asked Sarah, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not really," she admitted, squeezing my hand tightly. "But we can't turn back now." Together, we stepped into the room. The flickering light came from a bare bulb hanging overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The sight of the room was disorienting. Old photographs lined the walls, but these were different from the ones upstairs. They showed blurred figures in distress, their faces twisted in expressions of fear, sadness, and longing. "Look." Sarah pointed at one photograph in particular. "That's the receptionist." She was right. The same man who had checked us in stood in the corner of the photograph, but the picture was different. His eyes were hollow, and he seemed to be reaching out, as if trapped in a nightmare of his own. "What does this mean?" I whispered, fear creeping into my voice. Before Sarah could respond, the room grew colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The humming intensified, morphing into whispers, echoing around us. "Leave, leave, you must leave," they chanted, a chorus of lost souls desperate for release. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We both jumped, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The shadows around us began to pulse and swirl, coalescing into shapes that danced at the edges of my vision. "We're not alone," I said, my voice quaking. "We need to find a way out." As I scanned the room for an exit, a low, rumbling voice broke through the whispers. "You cannot escape your fate." I turned to find the receptionist standing in the doorway, his form flickering between solid and translucent. The shadows wrapped around him like a cloak, enhancing his menacing presence. "You've checked in," he said, his voice echoing like a distant thunder. "You must confront your fears, or you'll be trapped here forever." "Confront our fears," I challenged, my voice rising with defiance. "You think we're afraid of you? We're afraid of being trapped in this hell." He stepped closer, the shadows swirling around him. "Your fear is what keeps you here. Only by facing it can you hope to leave." Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. "What does he mean?" "I don't know," I replied, panic creeping back into my voice. "But we have to try." Suddenly, the room trembled, and the photographs began to shake. Faces in the images twisted and contorted, their expressions shifting from fear to anguish. I felt a crushing weight pressing down on me, threatening to pull me into their despair. "Let us out," Sarah cried, stepping forward. "We don't belong here." The receptionist raised his hand, and the shadows surged toward us, enveloping us in darkness. "Face what haunts you. Only then can you leave this place." I felt a surge of anger and fear, memories flooding back. My past mistakes, my insecurities, all the moments of weakness that had haunted me. I realized that he was right. I had to confront my fears, not just for myself, but for Sarah too. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking through the chaos. I refused to be afraid anymore. With every ounce of strength, I pushed back against the shadows, envisioning my fears dissipating into the light. "I will not let you control me," I roared, the words echoing off the walls. The room shook violently, the photographs shattering as the darkness began to recede. The receptionist's expression changed, confusion flickering across his face. "No, you cannot." But it was too late. The shadows began to unravel, swirling around us like smoke before dissipating into the air. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity and strength. "Sarah, come on!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. "Let's go!" We ran to the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily. Bright light flooded in, illuminating the darkened room as we stepped into the hallway. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of the storm outside. We dashed through the hallway, racing towards the exit. As we reached the front door, I turned back one last time. The receptionist stood at the end of the corridor, his expression now one of sorrow rather than malice. "Remember," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Fear is a prison, and only you hold the key." With that, I pushed the door open, and we stumbled out into the pouring rain, the storm washing over us like a cleansing flood. As we drove away from the motel, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I looked at Sarah, relief flooding through me. "We made it," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "Yeah," she replied, her eyes bright with tears. "But what about those who are still trapped?" I glanced back at the motel, its silhouette receding in the distance. "They'll have to find their own way," I said softly. "But at least we're free now." As we drove into the night, the storm began to fade, and I knew that I would never forget the lesson learned in that haunted motel. To face your fears is to embrace the light that exists even in the darkest places.